his bachelor's degree in philosophy at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania and is now a PhD student at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, who hopes to secure a firm defense date in May if the stars are correctly aligned and if the gods allow it. His focus lies primarily on the thought of Heidegger and Nietzsche. He is deeply interested in the role that art and aesthetics play in terms of critical theory. He is also interested in how Nietzsche's genealogical critique has been taken up by postmodern thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze.
And I'd like to start by thanking Strand and Matt and whoever else may be responsible for having this conference. Okay, my paper is titled Nietzsche, Science of Redlichkeit, Tragic Wisdom and the Eruption of Laughter. And just a short epigram maybe to keep in mind as I read through the paper. And thus spoke Zarathustra, says, and let each day be a loss to us on which we did not dance once, and let each truth be false to us, which was not greeted by one laugh. It may not appear prima facie that Friedrich Nietzsche appreciates humor or that his thinking engenders anything of the kind. For those who read Nietzsche, his writings appear to work in the opposite direction. They are often highly provocative, abrasive, and grapple with the most serious issues: nihilism, the collapse of all traditional values, the death of God, and so on. I'm going to argue, however, that not only does Nietzsche elevate humor and laughter to a respected status like that of its tragic counterpart, they erupt in the very places where they would seem most out of place. Indeed, we will see that for Nietzsche, laughter and humor are ways of affirmation perfectly suited for a being like us, a human, all too human being. Strand, is there a way we can turn this folding lights on? Yeah. At my age, you start to go blind. Okay. Thank you.
That
wonderful, perfect. I can see now. Yeah. But before tackling Nietzsche, I want to say a few words on the intersection of humor and philosophy, two subjects that might not seem to have anything in common. This will serve to frame some of the overarching concerns in this paper. It is only until recently that comedy, laughter, and humor, which have been mostly relegated to a marginal status at best, are being recognized as phenomena worthy of philosophical reflection and status co-equal to their tragic counterpart. Dennis Schmidt gives voice to just this concern. Schmidt argues in his book on Germans and Other Greeks, Tragedy and Ethical Life, that inspired tragic art is necessary for an ethical orientation in our own contemporary world. Yet he also makes clear the importance of comedy when he states, quote, in the end, the full treatment of the relation of tragedy and philosophy needs to address the place of comedy in that relation. In addition, John Sallis also takes up comedy on many occasions, recognizing most importantly its inherent embedding within philosophy and vice versa. In his book Transfigurements on the True Sense of Art, he states, quote, comedy not only can address and be addressed by philosophy, but also can inhere as a moment within philosophy. And it can also happen that philosophy belongs to comedy. The two key words here are inhere and belong. What they disclose is a kinship between these two phenomena instead of a dichotomy where they remain distinct from one another. But it is Bernard Freiberg, our keynote speaker tonight, who gives comedy the fullest measure of its philosophical depth. And here, measure is the issue that beats at the heart of inspired comedy and philosophy. Reflecting on comedy, tragedy, and in this instance, the Platonic dialogues, Freiberg states in his book, Philosophy and Comedy, Aristophanes, Logos, and Eros, that, quote, in their own ways, the comedies, tragedies, and dialogues serve to draw human beings vicariously into the most human of endeavors, namely raising the question of measure, making the attempt to determine proper measure. Here, measure itself becomes a question, and one that permeates tragedy, comedy, and philosophy. When we speak of measure, we understand that it invokes limit. A limit provides a horizon in which things stand in relation to that horizon, as well as to other things within the horizon. When we say that measure has been exceeded, whether it is from the purview of a comedy, think of Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates in Clouds, or within philosophy, as I will hope to show in this paper with Nietzsche, what occurs is a transgression, and one usually done in the mode of self-forgetting. So it is with these things in mind that I look at Nietzsche's thought and its intersection with humor and laughter. If one were to try and distill a single important theme in Nietzsche's writings, an effort that would certainly generate its own laughter, it might revolve around his critique of knowledge as it relates to honesty in life. And here, honesty, in German, Redlichkeit, has a more nuanced meaning than the general prohibition against telling untruths, and that it is mainly focused on the work done by scholars and thinkers and the totality of the sciences the Germans called Wissenschaft. Thus, it is aimed at intellectual honesty as the cohesiveness that binds all of the sciences together: social, political, theological, natural science, philosophy, including logic. A young Nietzsche recognized not only the importance of intellectual honesty as the ethical dimension of a thinker's philosophical pursuits, he recognized something much more profound about it, namely that it might reveal something unanticipated, even monstrous. Hence, in a letter to his sister dated 1865, he asked, quote, "Is it then a matter of acquiring the view of God, world, and atonement, in which one can feel most comfortable? Or is it not rather true that for the true researcher, the result of his research is of no account at all? Do we, in our investigation, search for tranquility, peace, or happiness? No, only for the truth, even if it were to be frightening and ugly." To be sure, Nietzsche's investigations will indeed disclose something frightening and ugly. But more surprising is that its locus will lie within the heart of the very knowledge that had for a long time provided an optimistic veil against this monstrousness. So what exactly does Nietzsche disclose about our knowledge and its limits, and what is the role of laughter and humor? Nietzsche is essentially engaging in a post-Kantian critique of the very possibility of knowledge. That is, knowledge that is certain because it is grounded in a priori or transcendent principles. His assertion is that our science is never free of error due to its roots in our own sensate experience within the lived world. Up until Nietzsche's time, truth especially, in its philosophical sense, was most identified with the unchanging world of being, set in opposition to the contingent changing world of becoming, what is sometimes referred to as the sensible-intelligible divide. This notion of truth grounded in metaphysical principles would include such things as Platonic forms, the God of some scholastics, the intelligible realm, and so forth. But because Nietzsche recognized the fact that science is unable to adequately bridge the divide between the sensible and intelligible, that is, the empirical world of becoming and being, a satisfactory ground can never truly be established that would allow for truth to be fixed, certain, and eternal. Thus, when Nietzsche says with a comic playfulness that, quote, "Perhaps truth is a woman who has grounds for not showing her grounds," he is saying, like Heraclitus in so many words, that the certainty of unchanging truth is elusive. Consider, for example, logic and what is arguably its supreme principle, the principle of non-contradiction that provides the foundation of all science. Aristotle's definition of this principle in the Metaphysics states, quote, that the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect. And quote, that contradictory statements are not at the same time true. But concerning this principle, Babette Babbage reminds us in her essay, The Culture of Science as Art, that, quote, because reality is in flux away from what has been and toward what is not yet, reality, that is empirical nature, is always change. It is, like ourselves, part of the species of being hostage in time to the immutable reality of the dynamic mode of becoming, as both what is and what is not. Because of the stone fact that no fact is stone, the supreme law of philosophic knowledge, the principle of non-contradiction, lacks any purchase on the empirical world, because what is never beyond change or time, end quote. And this is exactly her point when she says that for this principle to be coherent, Aristotle needed to introduce time into its definition, and by doing so, essentially conceding it. Because the world of becoming is the world of chaos, flux, and change, science, and I'm using science in its widest definition as scientia, knowledge, for it to be coherent requires something stable and permanent as a relief of sorts in order to ground its knowledge claims and certainty. Thus, scientists, theologians, philosophers posit, many times unconsciously, their own necessary illusions in order that these enterprises be fruitful. But in this sense, illusion hardly counts as truth. This is precisely why Nietzsche states, quote, we have arranged for ourselves a world in which we are able to live by positing bodies, lines, planes, causes and effects, motion and rest, form and content. Without these articles of faith, no one could endure living, but that does not prove them. However, we expect science and its practitioners, those concerned with the truth, with a capital T, to be least likely to employ, as Nietzsche says, articles of faith. That is, to utilize illusions because we equate truth with the really real. Most believe that science, grounded in metaphysical principles, is describing the world the way it really is, because it assumes that the fixed, rigid realm of being actually lies behind the changing world as its guarantor. Yet Nietzsche is claiming that this is a mistake, to privilege the illusory world to the detriment of the dynamic, vital, lived world. This leads him to state in The Gay Science, quote, "It is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests." His assertion is that if one were to give the fullest measure to Redlichkeit, then the truth of science and its method could only lead to disillusionment, literally the taking away of illusion. It is once again a failure of Redlichkeit, of honesty, that Nietzsche finds is the problem. We can look at another example. The idea of illusion and transgression extends as well to the language we use to signify our world. And on Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense, Nietzsche states that dissimulation through language is nothing but the attempted preservation of those who try to evaluate and signify the world so as to claim the fixed mantle of truth. In other words, Nietzsche says, for that which is to count as truth now becomes fixed. That is, a way of designating things is invented which has the same validity and force everywhere. And the legislation of language also produces the first laws of truth, for the contrast between truth and lying comes into existence here for the first time. Nietzsche is clear. Language is used by individuals as a legislating force that attempts to designate truth. However, this drive towards universal truth is always only a perspective on the world, one that plays the role of preserving a particular linguistic community who use it, and thus it inevitably extends to morality and duty. As Nietzsche states, quote, "The feeling that one is obliged to describe something as red, another as cold, a third as dumb, prompts a moral impulse which pertains to truth. From the opposite, the liar whom no one trusts and all exclude." And Nietzsche is kind of playing the role of liar in the history of philosophy at this point. But what is really happening behind this impulse to universalize our language is not fixed at all. It is instead, Nietzsche claims, quote, "a mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been subjected to poetic and rhetorical intensification, translation, decoration, and which, after they have been in use for a very long time, strike a people as firmly established, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions," he says, "of which we have forgotten that they are illusions." Nietzsche goes on to say that these linguistic constructs employed within a social body, although metaphorical illusions that are many times distant from actual things, render a society obligated, consciously or not, quote, "to lie en masse in a style that is binding for all." In the end, however, the fluidity of words and language can never adequately grasp the object of their intention. These are just two examples of the kind of illusions we employ in our drive to knowledge, consciously or not, when we attempt to order the chaos and flux of the world. What they ultimately demonstrate, Nietzsche maintains, is the tragic limit of our knowledge, and for those attuned with the requisite Redlichkeit, the resulting tragic wisdom. It was always presumed that science's optimistic drive to truth was unbounded, indeed measureless, but Nietzsche's claim is that not only is science incapable of fully accounting for the chaos of becoming, direct apprehension of its own ground remains veiled because of the illusions it is built on. Illusions that hardly count as a ground for epistemological certainty, even though it privileges ground as the singularity of all knowledge. This leads Babbage to maintain that, quote, "science cannot critique itself, since the problem of science cannot be posed on the ground of science." End quote. Science and its optimistic impulse will inevitably founder up against its own tragic limits, so that all we may claim is that the only thing certain is uncertainty. Yet it is exactly here, at the limit, that Nietzsche takes a decisive turn. One could, as Nietzsche warns in The Birth of Tragedy, fall into resignation and pessimism, as Schopenhauer did. The prospect that certain knowledge is impossible, that we can never grasp any numinal essence, poses a real danger for a human will that might then ask why and what for. But Nietzsche proposes at this limit of our science that we embrace something else. He states, quote, "The philosopher of tragic knowledge, he does not restrain the uncontrolled drive for knowledge through a new metaphysics. He establishes no new faith. He feels that the removal of the ground of metaphysics from underfoot is tragic, and yet he can never be satisfied by the bright worldly gig of the sciences. He is building a new life. He restores to art its rights." If we are to come to grips with the abyss that has opened up before us, precisely where science, once serenely optimistic, has faltered, then we must affirm this very loss of ground by way of art, which includes the art of humor. Unlike science, art is under no illusion that it is anything but illusion. This is the rule, limit, and measure play in Nietzsche's thought. On the one hand, proper measure demands that science think its own ground and be mindful of what constitutes that ground in terms of truth claims. On the other hand, Nietzsche is claiming that science, like the Ouroboros image in The Birth of Tragedy, the snake that curls around and bites its own tail, quote, "spurred on by its own powerful delusions, reaches its own limit and can go no farther. The scientific drive that sees itself as the measure of all in the end can only meet the measureless. The knowledge that manifests itself at the limit where measure and measureless appear to mix as opposites is not the kind of proper knowledge grounded in metaphysical principles. It is tragic knowledge, what Nietzsche sometimes refers to as the Dionysian Abgrund, or the Dionysian abyss. It is here, at the limit, that tragic wisdom and art are necessary so that we can behold ourselves before ourselves in our true depth. The failure to recognize the limit of science is a failure of Redlichkeit, and therefore constitutes a serious transgression. But for Nietzsche, this self-forgetting also provides a fertile ground for humor. And there are multiple ways that humor is dealt with by Nietzsche. First, in The Birth of Tragedy, tragedy, of course, was presented as a means to save the will from resignation and pessimism by affirming this loss of ground through the interplay of the form-giving Apollonian impulse and the chaotic, abysmal Dionysian impulse. But Nietzsche is equally clear that comedy, too, in its particular way of shining, achieves the same affirmation of the Abgrund. This is evident in the crucial section 7 of The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche states in what is perhaps the ultimate pronouncement in this work, in my opinion, at the limit of science where it begins to falter, that, quote, "Here at this moment of supreme danger for the will, art approaches as a saving sorceress with the power to heal. Art alone can redirect those repulsive thoughts about the terrible or absurd nature of existence into representations with which man can live. These representations are the sublime, whereby the terrible is tamed by artistic means, and the comical, whereby disgust at absurdity is discharged by artistic means." So although this work deals almost exclusively with tragedy and its roots in ancient musical dithyrambs, nonetheless, Nietzsche is equally clear that comedy as well can vie for that space that pessimism would otherwise haunt. Nietzsche, who of course was inspired tremendously by the ancient Greeks, certainly has the comedies of Aristophanes foremost in mind. It was the genius of Aristophanes, Nietzsche claims, who was able to see the danger of knowledge in the form of Socratic dialectic run amok, and a culture that had until then embraced instinct and an existence that was often painful and absurd. And to be fair, Socrates redeems himself near the end of The Birth of Tragedy, the music-making Socrates. Aristophanean comedy, in its particular way of shining, helped restore measure to this Euripidean and Socratic excess by comically portraying and celebrating it. But there's another way that humor and laughter play a role in Nietzsche's thought. Unlike inspired tragedies and comedies that we gather ourselves in theaters for, or that we may read on occasion, Nietzsche showcases the critical role humor plays at this limit of our knowledge by aiming it at those most deserving or most in need of it. These would be what he refers to as the higher men, which are the educators and the knowers, and therefore those who ought to know better, because truth is their stated objective. And by the educators and the higher men, he doesn't mean just philosophers and things like that. He even means theologians and people like that. In The Gay Science, where cheerfulness and levity figure prominently, Nietzsche says in a short aphorism titled "On the Educational Establishment" that, quote, "In Germany, higher men lack one great means of education, the laughter of higher men. For in Germany, these do not laugh." Unable to find humor in our drive to knowledge, even in the supposed metaphysics that grounds its certainty, it's as if we are condemning ourselves in the way in which we practice science and morality to the kind of oppressive weightiness that Nietzsche's thinking hopes to free. Well, Nietzsche offers an answer in which our folly is connected to our very freedom over the things that we hold in the highest esteem. In this instance, our morality. Quote, he says, we need it against ourselves. We need all exuberant, floating, dancing, mocking, childish, and blissful art, lest we lose that freedom over things that our ideal demands of us. It would be a relapse for us with our irritable honesty to get completely caught up in morality and, for the sake of the overly severe demands that we make on ourselves, to become virtuous monsters and scarecrows. We have also to be able to stand above morality, and not just to stand with the anxious stiffness of someone who is afraid of slipping and falling at any moment, but also to float and play above it. How then could we possibly do without art and without the fool? We see that Nietzsche's thought is characterized by the kind of healthy transgression that says no to imperatives, that floats and plays outside of any syllogistic structure, that is out of step with the march enough so that it dances. If necessity that has traditionally been allied with being has any role at all, it is that art and folly are what is necessary as they temper our lives within the kinetic vitality, within the contingent world of becoming. Humor allows us to remain free, or as he puts it in quasi-medical terms, it keeps us from relapsing so that we don't lose the very freedom over the things we seek to understand. In other words, folly and wisdom in Nietzsche's thought are not opposites, they are akin. By standing above morality so that we appear to ourselves in the form of art, we are able to bear and even affirm the changing world of becoming where we find ourselves, our very bodies at the mercy of time, change, and decay. Why is an aesthetic existence such as this so important to Nietzsche precisely at this point of the tragic limit of knowledge? Once again, in The Gay Science, Nietzsche contends that, quote, as an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable to us, and art furnishes us with the eye and hand, and above all the good conscience, to be able to make such a phenomenon of ourselves. At times, we need to have a rest from ourselves by looking at and down at ourselves, from an artistic distance, laughing at ourselves, or crying at ourselves. We have to discover the hero no less than the fool in our passion for knowledge. We must now and again be pleased about our folly in order to be able to stay pleased about our wisdom. And precisely because we are at bottom grave and serious human beings, and more weights than human beings. Nothing does as much good as the fool's cap. End of quote. So what we come to realize when we ruminate on Nietzsche's text and thought is his deep reverence for humor, comedy, and laughter. In a letter to his close friend Peter Gast in 1883, he makes exactly this point when he pens, quote, the writer of comedy is of the higher species and must be more good than the other, whether he wants to or not. By the time Nietzsche wrote the fourth part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a work he described as most important to him, laughter will reach its zenith in his thought. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was not written for an audience in Nietzsche's time, a time he characterized as one of, quote, dull and dismal seriousness. But for us today, it was future-directed and to be taken up by those who had ears for Zarathustra's message of the Übermensch and the eternal return. A key way to attune oneself to this message is to hear laughter's occurrence as constituting that very moment of Dionysian affirmation and amor fati, the love of fate. Indeed, Nietzsche Zarathustra says at one point, quote, this crown of the laughing one, this rosary crown, I myself set this crown on my head. I myself have sanctified laughter. And we heard that quote this morning from Abukar. What exactly does this sanctification mean? Laughter becomes, in a sense, a weapon that is wielded against the spirit of heaviness that is the past, or one might say, it is wielded against epistemological and moral prejudices that are grounded in the supposed unchanging principles of good and evil. Whoever wants to kill most thoroughly, Nietzsche claims, laughs. One kills not by wrath, but by laughter. Zarathustra wonders also at one point, when will my hour come? This wondering affirms his locus in the crucial in-between time, the time where we find ourselves at the tragic limit of science, where nihilism looms, but where, nonetheless, Zarathustra yearns to go under to mankind once more. And in order to discern the right moment, that is the moment when Zarathustra is going under, tips the scales forward towards the future, Zarathustra says he needs a sign, and this sign is none other than the laughing lion. Quote, "This is what I wait for now. Signs must come to me first that it is my hour, namely the laughing lion with a swarm of doves." As a symbol of pride and freedom, the laughing lion then is the cue Zarathustra is waiting for, a sign that humankind is prepared to hear his message and take up the freedom that is necessary if one were to live as an authentic value-creating voice free of more metaphysico. Thus, the laughter of the lion is the affirmation of the tragic view of life. The eruption of laughter by the lion at this point in Nietzsche's later writings is the first act of a will that is simultaneously a no saying to the past, anchored in the iron hand of moral imperatives and good and evil, and a yes saying that turns towards the future to affirm chaos and multiplicity. And this idea of turning also has a long history in philosophy. Nietzsche is essentially saying, in what is antithetical to the philosopher's pursuits, that we need to unlearn much in order that we can learn to laugh over and past ourselves. Thus, laughter, a phenomenon of usurpation, is the key phenomena Zarathustra waits for, so that the overman may then play forth out into the freely open. As we see then, laughter in Nietzsche's thought is much more than a heuristic device to be used as a tool on occasion to combat gloominess or melancholy. It marks out the very moment of truth and affirmation. This is precisely why Nietzsche, in a play on the word Vorsagen, which means to predict or foretell, and Voren is the root of this word, he refers to, quote, Zarathustra, the soothsayer, the Vorsager, Zarathustra, the truth laugher, der Vorlacher. This point provides an apt time to conclude. The humor found in Nietzsche's thought is one whose echo reaches us as a call of reattunement or reorientation back to the earth. It is a means by which Fröhliche Wissenschaft, that is, cheerful science that does not seek to betray its abysmal origins, can be practiced in the service of life. This is precisely why he seeks a future alliance between tragic wisdom and laughter, hoping that, quote, perhaps even laughter still has a future. Perhaps laughter will then form an alliance with wisdom. Perhaps only gay science will remain. At present, things are still quite different. At present, the comedy of existence has not yet become conscious of itself. At present, we still live in an age of tragedy and an age of moralities and religions, end quote. Until we come to grips with our science, moralities, and religion in terms of their reach and measure, we will remain mired in the eternal comedy of existence, and the joyful laughter of affirmation will remain a not yet, and only a hope for the future. For Nietzsche, the present still affords him and other free spirits who maintain the requisite Redlichkeit a spectacle. It is one of self-forgetting among those supposed knowers and of humankind, both at play in their own unconscious comedy rooted in nihilistic practices. At the same time, art at the tragic limits of science calls us to witness, and what we witness in all of our tragedy and comic absurdity is the sum of our shining. We are witnesses to ourselves. No longer impressed by the old currency of good and evil, Nietzsche asks that we learn the lion-willed laughter that affirms being here tied to the elemental earth, as the kind of being that we are. A laughing being potentially, a human, all too human being for sure. And with that, I conclude.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions from Michael as well.
In about the middle of your reading, you mentioned regarding art, and there was a line about childishness in there and something else ridiculing. It made me think of outside of art. Right? How do you see that as impacting the level of seriousness in society, people being exposed to that type of art?
What kind of art were you doing?
Outsider art?
Like hyper-real art and that type of thing, marginal art?
Untrained artists.
Like what?
Untrained.
Oh,
Unclassically, I mean,
Yeah.
okay, I see. And how does that?
Well, because the impact of that on the level of seriousness in society, as people are exposed to that type of art with a different, it makes the question more measured.
Right, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, sometimes when we think that, you know, when we as human beings, we go see art, that, you know, we go to the big galleries and things like that. But, you know, untrained art furnishes, you know, human beings with ways to, you know, play with appearance in their own way, and opens up, you know, possibilities as well. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. Strange.
Well, I don't know if this is really a question, as maybe a prompt or something, but so I noticed that you had several quotes from Nietzsche, or at least interpretations, like folly and wisdom are akin, this kind of thing.
Right.
And that, you know, we just heard Marianne talk, and at the end she concluded, right, that wisdom and humor might be akin, but I thought that you were drawing a distinction between wisdom and the practice of philosophy, right? I wonder what you would think of that distinction. You also had quotes like noting the entanglement of humor and philosophy right there.
Yeah.
Entwined.
Yeah, I mean, my reading of Nietzsche is that, you know, that folly and humor are not distinct. They disclose something fundamental about us, about the human being. Okay, so where maybe in the past, you know, philosophy, you know, stresses wisdom, right, and not folly. Aquinas, stresses this type of thing and stuff like that going back. Nietzsche doesn't see it that way. He says that, you know, if we are to be wise, you know, we have to recognize our folly, because it discloses us, you know, in a certain way, in a way that we can see ourselves. And he ties it, as I said in that one quote, to our seriousness, right? We need to embrace our folly. We need to see it. We need to hold up pieces of ourselves, not just the tragic aspects, but, you know, our folly and humor and comedies and things like that. Because, you know, we're serious human beings, right? So they're akin in Nietzsche's thought. They're not separate. You know, that's my reading. And I know people have, you know, a different reading that where they have to be kept more separately. But I think, you know, comedy and folly and things like that disclose something profound about, you know, the human situation, you know, being wounded and stuff like that.
So that for you, philosophy, would you agree with what Marianne was saying about philosophy maybe being better suited to address serious issues? Would you draw that distinction that she drew between wisdom and philosophy?
See, I don't necessarily draw the distinction, because I think it is through, you know, comedy and things like that, that serious things are celebrated, and vice versa. I mean, writers like John Sallis, or, you know, if you look at his great Being and Logos, he reads the Cratylus as essentially a comedy, right? And to be fair, you know, as an undergrad, when I first read Nietzsche, like first picked it up, if you were anything like me, your jaw hit the floor, right? Reading Nietzsche is just like in your face. And I didn't see anything comic about it, anything humorous. I remember coming home and saying, I gotta hide this from my parents and not let them see that, you know, what this is. And it was only till later that, you know, I recognized the humor that Nietzsche uses, and, you know, turns of phrase, and the importance of comedy and things like that I had not recognized before. But that doesn't divorce itself from the serious aspects, you know, of the thought. It discloses something profound about them. So to me, they're akin. And I know people have, you know, opposite view, but they're akin.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your paper, so thank you for that. My question is, how would you relate the art of humor, gay science, not to truth as eternal essence or pure intelligible as opposed to the changing appearances of the sensible, but as aletheia?
Yeah.
And maybe with regard to how language, through humor, can enact what truth is in terms of aletheia.
Right. One of the things, Babette Babbage, and she's one of the commentators that I really appreciate as well, says that, you know, for Nietzsche, we have to maybe find new ways of, you know, what truth means. Maybe it's no longer with a capital T. And one of the ways that she suggests, maybe a coherence theory, pragmatic, but one of the ways that I like is the aletheic way, you know, and maybe phenomenological way. And, you know, ways that aren't rooted in some transcendent principle that supposedly is unchanging for all time and has to hold for all peoples. With that said, I mean, when we think about what Nietzsche says about language and stuff like that, it's a mobile army of metaphors and things like that that change over time, and a lot of people don't recognize that. When their culture says that, you know, that is X, that's what it is, no matter where you're at. And so Nietzsche wants us to look at these ideas, this fluidity of truth and stuff like that. Not just see it as fluid, but step behind it and look at what is motivating those who make these kind of claims of truth, what is motivating them to do it. And for him, it's, he's going to claim that it's a way to preserve, their way of life or something like that. And so for Nietzsche, it's not that truth has to be, or it's not that he's anti-science or anything like that, against science. He wants science and art and things like that to be in service to life. Okay, at one point he puts that it has to affirm, life ascending values as opposed to life descending values. And for that you need he calls it a physician of culture, right? Philosophy, the philosophers must, keep their eye on science and work with science. So it's not an anti-science or getting rid of science, but, using science, understanding how it arises and how it can be in service to life.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, and especially that one passage from Birth of Tragedy about how science gets to the limits and then tragic wisdom.
The Ouroboros.
Well, I guess I've always read that a little bit differently. I thought like in a geometric space, as science expands its sphere of knowledge, it finds out on the infinite number of points on the sphere of what it knows, there's an infinite number of unknowns. And then the snake demon's tail would be the tragic wisdom that surrounds that, right? But despite how we picture it,
You picture it much better than I do. That's the first
So science, I don't think knows it's staring at the abyss, and I wonder what you have to say about that. And I think a particular friend of mine who's a chemist, and he believes there's a granularity of the world, so you're never going to get to the point where, as you expand your sphere of knowledge, you have more infinite unknowns, because he thinks, no, it's granular, there's a finite series of knowns, and we're going to know them. He's very optimistic that we're getting closer and closer to all of those knowns.
Yeah.
So do we still think that science is confronting the abyss? Because the scientists don't think they are, as far as I know. And I think a Nietzschean reading of our modern world would say, well, you're on nihilist, you don't even know it, or something like that, right?
This science is giving like a material accounting of the world and stuff like that today.
Right.
Might be moving in a different direction than in Nietzsche's time. Yeah, that's a good point. You said at the beginning, do scientists know that they're staring into the abyss?
Right.
Well, that comes to the question of, goes back to me the question of Redlichkeit. Either way, like, do they know that they're staring into the abyss? Do they know that there are limits, if one accepts that there are limits? And whether they know or don't know, Redlichkeit honesty is the requisite to explore that and to see what their foundations are built on and stuff like that. Today's science, I think, is a lot different and moving in a different direction. Here we hear the material end of science, but, that the things are limited, that the universe is going to be understood and things like that. We hear about the Higgs boson and, things like that. Do they know that they're staring into the abyss? I don't know. I don't know.
I think we should tell them.
Science has always claimed, the way I see it, even, whether it was Nietzsche's time or before or contemporary time, that they're always going to be moving forward. And we're going to get there. And we're, going to find out, but, and another way that I'm trying to think about it too is not just what their knowledge claims are, but what the ground is that they're basing that on. That's what Nietzsche is also looking at, these metaphysical principles. What constitutes that ground? Is that world, the unchanging world of being, really there? And the human all too human, Nietzsche says, the existence of the metaphysical world is hardly to be doubted. If you read that sentence on its own in Nietzsche, it might perk your, eyes up a little bit. It's hardly to be doubted. But then the next thing he says is, but what would be of that world is to be chopped off the human head. And it's a little bit of a paraphrase. It's, the worlds that we, posit and create.
Okay, well, let's thank Michael.